My name is Yvonne Lau, and I'm the Director for the Division of Education and Development at the Office for Human Research Protections. I'd like to welcome you all to this 2-hour workshop supporting ethical research involving American Indian and Alaska Native populations. The goal of this event is to help investigators and IRB reviewers successfully navigate the intricacies of conducting research with these communities. In today's workshop, 4 distinguished speakers will share their knowledge and experience on research involving tribal populations, following which there will be a 30-minute panel discussion moderated by Ms. Jyoti Angal. During today's workshop, we won't be accepting questions from the audience. Now, we are very privileged today to have the Assistant Secretary for Health, Dr. Rachel Levine, delivers the welcome address.
Hello, my name is Dr. Rachel Levine. I am so pleased to be able to join you today virtually for this important conversation. We are working to implement President Biden's executive order of advancing equity for all, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. Research involving human participants plays a crucial role in identifying the medical and social hardships faced by the American people. We cannot know how our policies and programs perpetuate barriers to opportunities and benefits for advancing the health and well-being of people of color and other underserved groups without sound and ethical research into these questions. And yet, the research enterprise has not always focused on the needs of the historically underserved and marginalized, nor has it always been respectful of the participants it requires to advance scientific knowledge. We must acknowledge that the Tuskegee study, one of the most horrific examples of unethical research in recent history, continues to perpetuate mistrust in the research enterprise. Well, now more than ever, we must recognize that research is essential, but doing so with the utmost respect for the autonomy and rights of research participants must be an even more important priority. One of our OASH offices, the Office for Human Research Protections, has the mission of protecting the rights, welfare, and well-being of people who participate in research studies that HHS supports or conducts. That office, OHRP, is dedicated solely to protecting research participants and promoting ethical research. This OHRP-hosted workshop supporting research involving American Indian, Alaskan Native populations will address tribal interests in research, notions of community harm, and offer suggestions for balancing research interests and Indigenous values. It will focus on the importance of the perspectives of Indigenous communities and help the research community navigate the complexities of conducting ethical research with members of these communities. This workshop, as well as all of the work of OHRP, directly supports our mission to stand with marginalized communities, to provide support and do our part to ensure that their health and well-being are treated with the attention it deserves. And our systems are actively furthering the President's initiative for justice and equity. I wish you the very best for a productive and impactful meeting, and I look forward to continuing our work together.
So thank you very much, Dr. Levine. Jyoti Angal is a dear friend of OHRP and a current member of the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections. She is the Director of Clinical Research at the Avera Research Institution and the former Director of the Regulatory Knowledge Core with the NIH-funded Collaborative Research Center for American Indian Health. Jyoti has worked extensively to build policies and infrastructures to support quality and ethical research with tribes of North and South Dakota and Minnesota. I'm now going to pass the rest of the time over to Jyoti and our invited guests.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you to OHRP for hosting this event on such an important topic. It's my honor to moderate today's session and great privilege to introduce our 4 distinguished speakers. Our first speaker today is Dr. Spiro Manson. Dr. Manson is a distinguished professor of public health and psychiatry and directs the Centers for American Indian and Alaska Native Health within the Colorado School of Public Health at the University of Colorado, Denver's Anschutz Medical Center. His programs include 10 national centers which pursue research, program development, training, and collaboration with 225 Native communities across the country. Dr. Manson has acquired $268 million in sponsored research to support his work and published over 280 articles in various fields of public health. His numerous awards include APHA's Rima Lapau's Mental Health Award, 4 special recognition awards from IHS, election to the National Academy of Medicine, and most recently, CDC Foundation's Elizabeth Fry's Health Education Award. He is widely acknowledged as one of the nation's leading authorities on Indian and Native health. Thank you, Dr. Manson. Our next speaker is Dr. Amy Elliott. Dr. Elliott is the Chief Clinical Research Officer at Avera Health and a professor and co-division chief for the Department of Pediatrics at the University of South Dakota School of Medicine. Dr. Elliott has been the principal investigator of numerous large NIH-funded multi-site longitudinal projects focused on maternal and child health, as well as American Indian health initiatives. Dr. Elliott has received over $83 million in external funding to support these projects and community-based programs. Dr. Elliott served as the principal investigator of the Safe Passage Study, a large multi-site community-based research study first funded by NICHD to look at the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure on fetal and infant mortality. She was also the founding principal investigator of the NIMH-funded Collaborative Research Center for American Indian Health, the only transdisciplinary center that focused on AI health. PERCA, as it's popularly known, provided a platform that brought together tribal nations and health researchers from across multiple disciplines to build research infrastructure. Our third speaker is Ms. Rachel Tracy. Ms. Tracy is a proud member of the Navajo Nation and received her MPH from the University of Oklahoma and her bachelor's degree from Arizona State University. Currently, Ms. Tracy serves as the Indian Health Service Health Research Director and Chair of the National Institutional Health Review Board. Her professional career has taken her down the path of 25 years of public service at the IHS, NIH, the California Rural Indian Health Board, and the Intertribal Council of Arizona, where she's gained expertise in public health, community health, health education, and implementation of human research protection programs. Ms. Tracy has had the honor of working with American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Filipino, Latino, and African American communities throughout the United States. Our final speaker for today is Dr. Cynthia Pearson. Dr. Pearson is a professor at the School of Social Work, an adjunct professor with the American Indian Studies and director of research at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington. Dr. Pearson provides oversight for research studies, including the development of institute and tribal partnership policies, quantitative and qualitative methods, and data-related activities, as well as human research protocols. Since 2006, Dr. Pearson has collaborated with Native American communities in designing and implementing community-based prevention programs and the development of tribally approved research policies, such as data use agreement and research and publication guidelines. Her efforts have contributed to 47 community and university-led grants and over 62 publications. Thank you all for your willingness to be a part of today's webinar, and we're honored to have you as subject matter experts to lead the session. So I will pass the baton over to you, Dr. Manson, for the first session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lau and Dr. Angal, for your introduction today and for the opportunity to join my distinguished colleagues and the audience in one of the most timely and important conversations of the day for those of us who are members of, as well as working with American Indian Alaska Native communities. My focus in opening our session today is on the respective roles and place of Native communities, investigators, and research sponsors, with particular attention to navigating the organizational, political, and cultural differences among them that often contribute to the unwitting tensions that often precede. Next slide, please. Dr. Levine mentioned the Tuskegee study, and of course that with respect to American communities, and has reverberated throughout many of our constituents for decades. But we too in American and Alaska Native communities have our equivalents, and they're two of note. The first is the Barrow alcohol study, a study that was conducted by the Institute of Man from Tulane University back in the late 70s. Which resulted in a report to a major conference in New York that was later featured in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And you can see here at the end of the first paragraph how that particular headline was featured: Alcohol Plagues Eskimos. And with the foreshadowing that, the nature of this particular Alaska Native community was likely to be extinguished as a consequence of suicide driven by alcohol. Next slide, please. Perhaps what many people did not realize is that in addition to further stigmatizing this particular population, the municipal bonds supporting community development for the municipality of Barrow dropped from an A rating to a C+, crippling the ability of that community to garner the funds to continue to develop their local resources and facilities. A major consequence of this misstep in terms of reporting out not only faulty, but stigmatizing research. Next slide, please, Ron. And of course, probably the one that's more recent and better known to many in this audience is the Havasupai tribe in the Arizona State University tensions that arose and the legal lawsuits that ensued in regard to the misuse of biospecimens and particularly DNA information and the misuse of that information to examine matters of far afield of the original stated purpose negotiated with the Havasupai tribe, and exploring matters of risk beyond that of diabetes, which was the original focus, to matters of Alzheimer's disease, and even used to trace ancestral migration across the continents. Next slide, please. And this particular set of issues engendered enormous outcry from not just simply the Havasupai tribe, but Indian communities across the country, and precipitated many of the conversations that we have today and underlie them. Next slide, please. Dr. Levine also mentioned President Biden's executive order expanding and reasserting the focus on the rights and obligations of the federal government to our tribal sovereignties. And of course, this goes back to the original Bush and Reagan administration in terms of President Reagan's establishment of the initial executive order around the government-to-government relationship between the federal government and tribal governments. And from the outset, set the tone, and with increasing attention to the requirements and the obligations of each to the other. Next slide, please. This executive order was reaffirmed in the next set of administrations with President Clinton, and in fact expanded and encouraged the development of new institutions within the federal government to enact and honor this government-to-government relationship. Next slide, please. The first set of concrete actions that evolved from these series of executive orders, driven and fueled in part by the consequences of the Barrow alcohol study and the Havasupai and Arizona State University circumstances, led to the establishment of institutional review boards in many American and Alaska Native communities. You can see here just some of the earliest and most prominent examples of those institutional review boards. It's important to note that these institutional review boards are not only chartered under the current obligations of the federal government in terms of protecting human subjects, but also often serve a broader role. And that is to provide community review of the priority, the importance, the salience of the particular topics that investigators, often external to tribal communities, propose to undertake, and also are designed to ensure that tribal communities have appropriate roles and partnerships in all aspects of this research. Next slide, please. We saw this particular emphasis continued in George W. Bush's presidential administration, with even increased presence of tribal leaders from across the country, and among the very first senators from our own state here in Colorado, Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell, and their involvement and support and working together with the George W. Bush administration in ensuring that these executive orders were not only continued, but enhanced. Next slide, please. Most recently, prior to the Biden administration, we saw these executive orders further affirmed by the Obama administration, who more than any other previous presidents reached out to tribal communities in terms of visiting us in our homelands, as well as affirming in a variety of different ways the commitment to the Obama administration to the principles and actions that are embedded within these executive orders. Next slide, please. What we saw then was an expansion beyond the establishment of the tribally defined and chartered institutional review boards to actual development of tribal consultation policies that now have become a critical part, expectation and requirement on the part of the federal government with respect to exploring and understanding its obligations and working relationships with federally recognized tribal communities. And you can see here in the context of Dr. Sebelius's leadership at DHHS, we saw a substantial increase in the codification of the steps and policies and procedures and protocols surrounding this consultation policy, complete with actual handbooks for federal agencies and their representatives for how to undertake this consultation process. Next slide, please. All of this work in leading up to the most recent series of expectations and requirements around tribal consultation as a centerpiece of the government-to-government policies and expectations are a series of challenges as the federal government and tribal entities and others working in the fields between them, particularly those of science and research, of navigating the differences that are embedded in these policies, the histories, as well as the particular assumptions that are afoot in each of those arenas. And so I want to turn for a moment to discussing the differences between the federal government and universities, as many of the settings within which this research sponsored by the National Institutes of Health and other agencies within DHHS unfold, as well as place them in counterpart to the very similar kinds of assumptions within tribal communities. So let me first focus on organizational differences. So we see with respect to universities and the federal government, we have 5 major assumptions afoot here in terms of their work and their approach to research and their relationship to other entities, tribal communities among them. The first is that in this particular context, their decision-making is hierarchical and rule-driven. The process emphasizes efficiency, replicability, and written documentation around those elements of the decision-making process. The leadership is clearly formal and it's centralized, and it's often without reference to the context in which a given organization, either at a university or a federal entity, is operating with respect to the particular work that it proposes to undertake with tribal communities. In sharp contrast, looking at the very same elements in tribal communities, we see that decision-making is much more likely to be horizontal, precedent-oriented, and consensual. And you can see immediately the potential conflicts between this orientation to decision-making and the counterparts with respect to universities and federal government. The process is fluid, it's iterative, it's recorded orally for the most part, and it's benchmarked by key events, not necessarily chronological time. The leadership and the responsibilities and duties and obligations of the leadership within tribal communities are shared. They're often much more diffuse, and they're ascribed rather than simply attributed to individuals who may be occupying these key positions of leadership. The emphasis is on distributive cognition. That is, that there are important perspectives and knowledge and understanding that are distributed across a community and are not lodged entirely or wholly within a particular set of positions within the community. And it assumes that there may be multiple perspectives and multiple answers on various issues or questions. And ultimately, authority is rooted in the collective competence of the community, not attributed to an organizational locus. Next slide, please. The second major area of tension that arises and the need to navigate is in terms of political differences. So with respect to universities and federal government, we see that representation is as a collective of individuals, of individual constituents, that the objective here in the context of navigating the political landscape is that competence stems from delegated authority, and flows from administrative license. Accountability is couched in terms of blameworthiness and liability. And ultimately, obedience to these kinds of political differences within the federal government and universities is through instruction and compliance. In sharp contrast, in tribal communities, representation is of an individual collective, not a collective of individuals. It is of a body politic. The objective is to manage interdependent relationships among the key members of tribal communities. Authority is rooted in moral and social responsibilities that are beheld by the particular leaders in these communities. And accountability is framed quite differently. It's framed as an obligation to and acceptance by other members in tribal communities. And ultimately, conformity to these expectations is through adherence to shared values and a variety of mechanisms for reaffirming and reminding leaders that that's their obligation. Next slide, please. And thirdly, the major domain is the cultural landscape itself and the differences that emerge there. In the non-tribal world, the basic assumptions tend to revolve around egocentrism. And there is an enormous emphasis on prizing of privacy and anonymity. There is an emphasis on majority opinion. There is particular attention to being goal-directed and valuing of problem solving per se. And time itself is perceived as a commodity to be limited and managed over time. And again, in parallel, in tribal communities, we see that the notion of one's personhood, membership in the community is sociocentric, not egocentric. That there is a prime emphasis on seeking cooperation and de-emphasizing conflict among one another. The approach here stresses mutuality, of belonging, of solidarity among the members of the community. There is an enormous indulgence and toleration of differences among members in the community, and the expectation that these differences will be managed, recognized, honored, but ultimately sorted out. And then lastly, the way in which decision-making and positions relevant to the research and subject protections are approached with a very careful note of caution, of being deliberate and patient, and assume that events will unfold rather than necessarily be dictated at the outset. Next slide, please. So from these differences in the political, organizational, cultural landscape between universities and the federal government and their tribal counterparts, we see 6 major points of tension that have very practical implications for how partnerships can be established, proceed, and built upon. The first, and my colleagues in the following presentations will review this in great detail, has to do with the review and approval of research itself, ensuring that tribal communities, for the reasons I've indicated here already, are not just simply full partners and consulted as a matter of requirement or an ad hoc nature, but have an opportunity to encourage and designed from the very outset, the nature of the questions to be addressed, the approaches for addressing them, as well as the nature of the data to be acquired, summarized, and disseminated. It has to do with the distribution of resources, often at odds with the assumptions of the universities and federal government about how resources should be distributed. Thirdly, it has enormous implications for the manner of informed consent and ultimately the nature and extent of accountability and control. Fifth, it has to do, and we've seen this very clearly in recent years, matters of data ownership and sharing. And we've seen this proceed under the rubric of decolonizing the assumptions surrounding ownership of data and the nature and extent to which it should be shared and the applications to which it should be put. And we see it as well in terms of a requirement for continued collaboration. The notion that once these partnerships are established, they are intended to be long-term, not simply short-term, which is one of the major challenges for investigators working through and supported by the grantsmanship process. Next slide, please. There are some recent examples for how these political organizations cultural differences can be successfully navigated. And again, the presenters this afternoon will detail these in greater specificity. But we have data sharing agreements that have been successfully negotiated and implemented consistently in honoring and respecting these kinds of organizational, political, and cultural differences that allow us in tribal communities, as well as in the science world, as well as sponsors, to meet the mutual obligations and expectations we have of one another and the work that we propose and undertake with one another. Next slide, please. For example, the National Congress of American Indians, I would refer you to their websites here that provide some wonderful examples of this. And I believe that Dr. Avera Health, the director of their Policy Research Center, is a member of the audience today and hopefully can share or comment on through the chat box some of the current work that they've done in this regard. And the National Institutes of Health, with their establishment of the Office of Tribal Health Research in Dr. Collins's office, has taken major steps forward in this regard. Next slide, please. We have seen in the context, for example, of the All of Us research program, a major research initiative that has been the focal point for enormous debate and has suffered the legacy of, in many ways, of the misplaced efforts of NIH with respect to the original Human Genome Project, which this builds upon, has gone to enormous lengths as of late to implement the tribal consultation process and listening sessions across the country to inform its policies, protocols, and procedures for approaching and inviting and securing partnerships with tribal communities and making appropriate access to the data. Next slide, please. I just want to indicate in closing that there's enormous and burgeoning literature that helps guide those of us in the science world, as well as universities and in the federal government, about these organizational, political, and cultural challenges, and provide us with examples for how one can successfully navigate. I believe that one of the biggest challenges we have in the federal government, whether it be DHHS or its other sister agencies, or NIH and its sister agencies within DHHS, such as SAMHSA, AHRQ, et cetera, is coming together and understanding and doing their homework with respect to what these policies, procedures, and protocols are, what are the political, organizational, cultural tensions that underpin them, looking for successful examples by which we have been able to address those tensions and advance our work jointly. And so I hope and trust that today's workshop will continue to promote those kinds of conversations as we jointly undertake the solutions for the challenges that face all of us together. So thank you for the opportunity today to be with you.
Thank you, Spiro. I learn something every time I have the privilege of hearing him speak, and it's such an honor to be part of this important event today. And thank you to OHRP and to Jyoti, as well as the panelists, for talking about this extremely important topic. I'm truly honored to be part of this. And so during the 20 minutes that I have of the agenda today, really going to focus on some lessons learned and recommendations for investigators in navigating this, in navigating terrain, navigating relationships, and how to help move projects forward. But most importantly, how to move important projects forward that actually will help improve health, and how we keep challenging ourselves as well in that area. So what I'm going to tell you is a little bit of a story of one of the projects that we grew up on, called the Safe Passage Study a bit, and some lessons learned, as well as how that all turned out. So I'm part of the Avera Health Network, which is a large rural health system located in the Midwest. These yellow states here show you some of our footprint, based right here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, but also have research offices in Rapid City and in Pine Ridge, and have worked in those areas for the past 20 years. And really, why I included as a speaker today is because I've been honored to be invited to help do healthcare research with not just Oglala tribe, but many other tribes in the region as well. We're also all faculty appointments within the University of South Dakota School of Medicine. And so as you can see here, these are where our 3 offices are located. And really, this is the staff that really get things done. One of our first underlying premises for trying to bring state-of-the-art science to the prairie, so we're not just a flyover state, was rooted in original need. Where are the need areas, and how do we apply the tools of the best science possible? And that if we put these two things together, have projects that are important, deal with true need, not just gaps in the literature, but true need, apply the tools of good science, that's when we're going to make the most positive impact on improving health, which is really the goal I know of so many of us. And so I know the details of this are a little hard to read. It's more a general trend I want you to look at. This is infant mortality by race. This is an area where our work really started. And as you can see here, I'll show you. So the y-axis is the rate of infant deaths. So this is per 1,000 live births. And then it goes from 1990 to 2017. Towards the end of this, I'm going to show you where the last couple of years have been, so you get an idea of where is this story now going. There's a couple time periods that are important here. But first, this more straight line here, it's orange on my screen, is the United States as a whole infant mortality rate. As you can see, nice decrease in the 90s, and then has relatively flattened out with maybe a little decrease in the last decade. This darker line right here that kind of jogs up and down is South Dakota infant mortality rate. More often than not, we're a little above the national average. Sometimes have had some really good years where we've been a little bit below, but generally kind of jogs along those lines. This line up here, or this purple line, is when we pull out the American Indian infant mortality rate in the state of South Dakota. As you can see, consistently, this is the definition of disparity right here, in the differences that exist for American Indian infant mortality rates. So an area I want to point out in particular is this area in the 90s. As you can see, at its highest, 21.53 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. This is more than 2.5 times what we're seeing at the national level. And as you can, if I were to fit a trend line on here, you can see since 1990, there has been a nice descending trend. And in fact, in 2017, the gap there is barely discernible. And again, I'll show you where the story is now going. Again, jumps around a little bit, but again, a nice descending trend. The other time period that I want to call to your attention is right in here, starting in around 2004 to 2017. This is the time period of the Safe Passage Study. So where the Safe Passage Study came from is in the 1990s, that time period I was showing you that had such a high rate, is the tribes approached NIH and the CDC and said, can you help us understand why is it that so many American Indian babies are dying in our region? And there are a few things that were surprising, that were hadn't been seen before. And it was the role of prenatal alcohol exposure on risk for infant death. In particular, if a woman drank during the first trimester of pregnancy and binge drank at that point in time, that study found about an 8-fold increase in risk for SIDS. And so after that study, then there was questions of, well, can we replicate that? What is it about prenatal alcohol and smoking exposure that convey that particular risk? Can this help us identify risk early, identify more mechanisms that might be amenable to intervention? And so this led to the Safe Passage study, which was a real large collaborative project with sites around the world. And phase 1, 2003 to 2006, feasibility testing, phase 2, 2006 to 2017, the full-scale hypothesis-driven. In total, we enrolled 12,192 pregnancies. The sites that were involved for clinical sites was in the Northern Plains. We had 5 sites total, 2 of which were on tribal nations. And then the other data collection clinical site was in South Africa. We had a physiology group out of Columbia University and a pathology group led by Hannah Kinney at Harvard. A data coordinating center and 3 institutes were involved. So it was quite a large effort. And so what ended up resulting from this was an extremely large, complex study of maternal child health that started involving the tribal nations that were involved from day one on everything that would get added in. What were the questions that would be answered? How is it that this is going to be able to work? And what resulted is a large study, as I mentioned, 12,192 pregnancies were enrolled. We saw the women 3 or 4 times during pregnancy at the time of birth, 1 month and 12 months of age. Went out to 12 months of age for the definition of infant mortality. This was a prospective study, so enrolled women early in pregnancy, followed them through 1 year. There were some fetal demises during that time where women lost their baby during pregnancy, as well as infant demises. And in these cases, then there was extra study protocols that people could elect to participate in to better understand cause of death. Something I want to highlight, so this very complex, involved study was occurring in areas that really weren't known for doing large scale complex studies that usually only saw at large academic institutions. And we had 86% compliance for study visits during this time. And this truly is testament to the frontline staff who worked with all of these participants, as well as I think the community commitment for each of these communities to help answer important questions around infant mortality. So as we were getting this study took up, which took about 3 years to get this stood up, there was a lot of discussion around collection of tissue and bloods, particularly postmortem. As you can imagine, this is extremely difficult conversations and during worst times of someone's life. And the tribes really landed on they wanted to leave it up to the individual choice and have options on the consent so that people could really tailor their participation in ways that they were comfortable with. There were some genetic studies as well. And one of the recommendations was a separate informational sheet on genetic studies so people could understand what that involved and what it did, as well as parameters of how that data could be used. Now, all these discussions were happening around the same time the Havasupai tribe case was being heard and really brought to the forefront. And in many, many ways, that the highlighting of what happened with Havasupai really facilitated these conversations because I think it took them to a much deeper level of where the risks were, not just for the researcher, but most importantly for the community and what things needed to get put in place so that there were protections that all would feel comfortable with moving forward. And there's always the option for a tribe or for an individual to say, nope, not for me. Or that's not a question that we think is important to answer. And so this is where it ended up turning out. Like I mentioned, the overall visit compliance, but we had extremely high consent for DNA, for placental tissue, photographs, and only 3% withdraw study consent, which and usually that was for moves. And also we're able to ascertain pregnancy outcomes for 96.5%. So the time spent setting this up and really working to get exactly how it could be done right paid off well in terms of participant involvement and commitment to this work. So here's some of my lessons learned. This is one of the quotes that I really think is applicable, not just to American Indian health research, but really a lot of different types of relationships, but most apt, I think, for this conversation. And this is the most productive, innovative teams were led by people who were both task and relationship oriented. What's more, these leaders changed their style during the projects. You always have to keep this relationship in mind, and work on building your relationships and never turn your back on that. Realize it's always being invited in to work with tribes on an important issue, such as infant mortality, is a privilege, it's an honor, and should never be taken for granted. However, if you're not also task oriented and you're not getting things done, that's going to deteriorate the production of this team very, very quickly. And so you have to balance these two things. As a principal investigator, or as someone working closely with tribal communities on any sort of research project. And that gets to be a balancing act, that you need to make sure you're moving both forward. So keys to success, and I realize that this is something we hear often, but is communication. I just can't be underestimated though. And having champions at every level of any organization that you're working with, whether it be the Indian Health Service, working with tribal governments, particularly healthcare organizations within the tribe as well, community agencies, and really make sure everyone knows and that they truly are part of a team, that their words matter, that their input matters, and it will truly influence what happens moving forward, and that there's also, you're getting regular feedback and giving regular feedback back so people know how things are going. This is critical from the very first moment when you're applying for a grant and asking for those letters of support, sending a thank you for writing a letter of support in the first place, keeping people updated on, did you get the grant? Did you not get the grant? If you didn't get it, what were some of the pieces of feedback that you got? Because I might be wanting to go for it again in the future, and then everyone can kind of keep learning from that process. If you did get the grant, have you notified your partners? These things sound very basic, but it can be easy to forget when you're busy trying to get a project off the ground how critical it is to make sure you're bringing everyone along on all of those steps in the journey. And so also having a very good understanding of culture and of all types of culture, and how your organizational culture matches or doesn't match with the communities that you're working with. I love the slides that Spiro showed where looking at the differences between tribal regulatory and more of a traditional academic scholarly regulatory environment. And having understanding where those differences lie can really help you understand where your biases are coming in, and where you may be trying to influence something in a way that's more comfortable for you, but not for your community partner. And also what your role is in this project. And not over extending your role in terms of thinking that you have to have the answers for everything, but also not underestimating it, realizing you're invited in for a reason, and that there's expertise that you can help convey in that team work to be able to help move things forward. Also, a good understanding of what really is the long-term goal and being very honest on where that is and how you're going to know if you've achieved it. All of us operate in these multiple cultures, and coming together and working together will go much smoother if you have a good understanding of how they all separately act and then seeing how it can work together. One of these is language barriers, and this just isn't the difference between, for example, English and Spanish, but between a discipline, between different disciplines. People think in different languages, and how much translation is actually happening during your conversations. And so no matter what those language barriers may be, how much translation is really happening? Because in those cases, you do need to make sure that you're going at a pace that everyone is able to really keep up with the complexities of the conversation. And are there other words in other languages for concepts that you're discussing that you might not be aware of? And these questions are very good to just ask up front. These language differences, again, can apply to different organizations, different just things words we use within our own institutions as well as professions. So making it work. Listen, listen, listen. You may feel sometimes like you're being told the same thing over and over again. but there's a reason people are telling you things over and over again, or multiple people are telling you it. It's because it's important. And so keep listening, even if it's a message that you feel like, yeah, I know that there's a reason you're being told this over and over again, and keep looking for the nuances in those messages and how it really applies to you. Second, infallible follow through. Do not drop the ball. If you have something on your plate to do, follow through. Become known as that individual who will follow through and get things done. That will help in all kinds of partnerships and really help distinguish you from those that are all talk, okay, which we all want to stay away from. Also realizing that this specific project or idea is not the most important thing on the plate of your community members or of your staff that are working in those areas. There's lots going on, and realizing kind of that you're not the most important thing, your project is not the most important thing, keeps a certain level of humility, but it also really helps you understand that context in which this work is happening. To be honest, it will help inform your work even better. So it is important to have a sense of urgency. I showed you the data before with infant mortality. It's important to have a sense of urgency. This is a huge problem, but you still have to take that time to build that solid foundation of trust. I love the quote from Stephen Covey, moving at the speed of trust. There's a book on that, and I just think that's so applicable to these sorts of collaborative projects. So here's what I was going to show you of, I wish this was a better end of the story, right? But it's not the end. It really is a continuation. But just to acclimate you, here's the rate, 2009 to 2020. This data was just finalized last week by our State Department of Health, and I got permission to be able to share to this group. So the blue line here is the white rate, infant mortality rate for the state of South Dakota. The light gray line here is total for South Dakota. The orange line here is for American Indians in the state of South Dakota, infants. And as you can see, and again, I showed you before, you know, kind of where some of that data came from the 90s. And this was where it ended before. In 2019, we see a jump. In 2020, now this is also the time of COVID, which we know greatly has created many complexities in healthcare. However, this number is starting to hearken what we were seeing in the 90s and is critically important. It also shows that there's just no one research project, there's no one thing. It's all about working together to try to help really tackle wicked problems that exist in health disparities. So that's a little bit about some of our story. I think this also is another quote that resonates with me. Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, but really working together is where you're going to find that success. So thank you to NIH in acknowledgement of the funding for the past 20 years that has helped support this work, to the team that really helps get these things done. And here is my contact information. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Elliott. Our next presenter is Ms. Tracy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present and speak with you all. I'm very honored to be part of this panel, and I'm just so excited and was excited to hear about the virtual workshop that OHRP was planning and that we're going to be so thankful for that we were able to pull it off today. So thank you so much. So I'll just go ahead and get started here. So I'll just give you some basic information about the Indian Health Service and our processes for review of research, and then also talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available or that can be available, but also some of the challenges that we deal with in the resources that we do have as part of the Indian Health Service. The IHS mission is to raise the physical, mental, social, and spiritual health of American Indians and Alaska Natives to the highest level. The IHS is unique in that we are a health system, and we provide health care services to American Indians, Alaska Natives, but we are also more comprehensive than just a healthcare facility and a healthcare system. We also include public health and a community focus in these services that we provide. Next slide. The IHS research program mission is to support national health research, including human subjects research protections and research related to health problems and the delivery of care to American Indian and Alaska Native people. Next slide. Institutional review boards are committees that review research studies to confirm that ethical practices and protections of human subjects are being followed. And one of our key guides that we follow is called the Belmont Report, and that makes sure that research observes the 3 principles of ethics, which are respect for persons, beneficence, which is to do no harm and to maximize benefit for those that are participating in research, and then justice. There are many types of IRBs, including academic, commercial, federal IRBs, which we have the Indian Health Service falls under the federal IRBs. We have university IRBs, and then we also have tribal IRBs. And the tribal IRBs come from a tribe, or they could be an individual tribally oriented organization that is administering an IRB that would review research within Indian communities, American Indian, Alaska Native communities. Next slide. So just a few, this slide just shows some of the basis of our IRB oversight. Back in 1991, the Federal Policy for Protection of Human Subjects, also known as the Common Rule, was published and was recently updated in 2018. The Common Rule is a regulation that guides research protections for studies with human subjects funded by certain federal agencies. The Department of Health and Human Services and the FDA have separate but complementary regulations for ethical research within with human subjects. The Common Rule affirms that additional information, the Common Rule affirms that each tribe may have its own definition of research and its own set of research protections and laws that may have more restrictions than the Common Rule. Researchers must also receive appropriate approvals and review from the tribe throughout the process. Dr. Manson touched on this briefly in his presentation on how tribal communities have grown over the years and have become much more astute at implementing their own research review and research development within their own communities. So a lot has happened over the last 10 to 15 years, which has been a really positive thing for tribes. Next slide. In addition to the researcher's own organization's IRB process and approval, a researcher must also receive appropriate approvals and review from the tribe and the Indian Health Service IRB, if applicable, throughout the process when developing the research idea, when applying for funding, while conducting research, and through the publication of research. If the tribe, through its own research review process, does not approve the proposed research, even though the research may have been approved by a separate IRB, like a university IRB or another federal agency IRB, the researcher cannot conduct that research with the tribe. This is the tribe's right as a sovereign nation. Next slide. So for human subjects research protections, research that's conducted in IHS facilities or with IHS staff or resources must be approved by an IHS institutional review board. This includes research done in tribal or urban facilities, since IHS tribal and urban sites fall under the IHS federal wide assurance. The FDA, which is an FWA. FWA is the IHS director's assurance to the DHHS Office of Human Research Protections that all research conducted under his or her purview will follow Title V CFR Part 45 CFR 46 and the Belmont Report. Tribal and urban facilities may also obtain their own FWA with OHRP, independent of IHS. Independent tribal and university IRBs that are not IHS, independent tribal university, do not have the authority to approve research conducted in federal facilities. So basically for the federal IHS facilities, the IHS IRBs are the only IRBs that have that authority to review and approved research being conducted in those types of facilities. So IRBs have concern for individuals where we focus on risks to subjects are less than minimal in relation to the anticipated benefits. Selection of subjects is equitable, especially with our vulnerable populations, such as pregnant women, children, or prisoners. And that could include a tribe as a whole. We do have some tribal IRBs that consider the whole tribe or the tribal community a vulnerable population. And that comes into play when we're considering whether a research study is exempt or expeditable from IRB review, or when it goes through IRB review. For example, Navajo Nation, they have an IRB that does not have an exempt policy, and they do not have an expeditable policy as part of their IRB review process. So any research that goes, because of the fact that they consider the community vulnerable, so any research project that's going through there would have to go through a full board review. We also want to make sure that informed consent is sought and properly documented, data collection process and disposition clearly defined, and more and more tribes are becoming much more involved in that process. And as mentioned before, that benefits the community and is the right of the tribe. Provisions are made to protect the privacy of individuals. That's always a primary concern of IRBs, and especially within, it's important overall within the Indian Health Service IRBs. We work really hard and do a lot of work on maintaining privacy of individuals, because we are also working with patients when the research is being conducted with our patients or within an IHS facility, or if they're not even directly working with, like conducting interventions directly with patients who are also study participants, but even just data flowing from our electronic health record databases out into research institutions or to researchers. We put a big emphasis on protecting the privacy of individuals. And we also want to make sure that people are not coerced in participating either by loss of services or huge incentives. Next slide. IRBs also have concern for communities. We want to make sure that tribal communities have full awareness and consent of, and that tribal communities are consenting to participate in these research studies. We require for researchers to obtain tribal resolutions or some sort of letter of support. Basically, again, making sure that the tribe is aware of the research that's taking place and consenting for their community to participate. And it may also include separate approvals from the healthcare system side of things. Just like for within IHS, we have service unit directors. We also have area directors. Each area has their own process for approval within IHS. So that's in addition to any tribal approvals that a researcher may be obtaining. We also want to make sure that the tribe is not being coerced into participating and understands any resource requirements, such as staffing, funding, and facilities. Sometimes tribes will get involved in, not just tribes, but even with IHS facilities, will get involved in consent for research to take place in their communities with not really understanding perhaps what's really going to be involved. Down the road, they may find out that their staff have to use some of their staff time to assist researchers. There may be some funding, that might need to be contributed. And then facilities is another thing. There's a whole, at least within IHS, there's other requirements that have to be, that researchers have to go through for research that's going to be conducted in a facility. And we also want to make sure that meaningful ownership and tribes have meaningful ownership and control over data, including review and input into publications when they're still in draft form, not after they've been already submitted to the like a journal. Ensure data that's collected for one study isn't used for other purposes without prior tribal approval. And it's not just a tribal approval thing when it comes to this point. We also look for that when we're looking at the rights of an individual who's participating in a research study. Next slide. So focus on tribal community. So our IHS and tribal IRBs have the best knowledge of their local community and can minimize potential harms and misunderstandings. These types of IRBs provide an extra layer of protection and often require additional steps and considerations. And Dr. Manson touched on this a bit in his presentation. Tribal members and tribal communities may mistrust researchers. So our IRBs and our researchers from within our communities may be helpful in educating communities about the purpose and the role of IRBs, and then the support of a local IRB may encourage more people from those communities to participate in research. Some of the, just an extra note here, some of the common issues that we see from an IRB perspective within IHS and also tribal IRBs is we have, sometimes there's of course lack of tribal approvals. We may find researchers lacking the human subjects training that they need, or they may be expired. We often come across data issues, whether it's access, ownership, and disposition. Within IHS, because again, we're dealing with electronic health record, we look at it from two perspectives, which is accessing data and then IHS disclosing data. And each of those is different and require different types of authorities for us to be able to allow the data to be shared. And then we sometimes see issues with consent forms. The reading level may be too high. There may be inadequate risks or benefits. Sometimes there's missing contact information of that IRB that's overseeing the contact, study. And a lot of our tribal IRBs and IHS will also require that our own contact information is included on the consent form versus just say the academic contact information from that IRB. Okay, next slide. So this is just a map of our institutional review boards within the IHS. We have one national IRB, which is located, administered out of here, headquarters in Rockville. We also have 8 other area IRBs that monitor research within those areas. And of the 12 IHS areas, 4 do not have an IHS IRB. In those cases, the national IRB reviews for those areas. So for example, California, Tucson, Bemidji, and there's one more that does not have an IRB, and the national reviews for those areas. Within those areas, the IRBs pretty much administer their own IRBs. They accept the protocols based on their standards. They conduct their reviews based on their standards. We have a pretty much common way that we all do it, but they also may have their own requirements within the area. So things to consider when applying to IHS. These are just some of the things that researchers should think about when they're thinking to apply to an IHS IRB, and that would be conducting research, requesting for data to do secondary research. These are some of the statutes and laws that we go through as we review research. And again, privacy and confidentiality. We have HIPAA to consider. Our IHS healthcare facilities are all subject to HIPAA and Privacy Act. Some institutions and federal agencies are not subject to HIPAA, and that sometimes causes some confusion. But basically, if the research is taking place within an IHS facility, tribal, urban, or federal, they are subject to HIPAA. And we also, again, look at the 42 CFR Part 2, which has to do with confidentiality of substance use disorder patient records. Just briefly, it's a kind of a technical statute, but that's another thing that we deal with because, again, we're dealing with patients in a healthcare system. All projects planning to collect information for non-clinical purposes from groups of IHS patients should be reviewed in advance with an IRB chair, because they may not necessarily have to go through IRB, but we may be looking at it from another perspective, like if it's a survey type research or quality assessment or quality improvement. But the IRB chair would be able to help researchers figure out whether they need to go through IRB or not. Okay, next slide. So in applying, again, additional things to think about when dealing with federal, tribal, and urban programs, and which also have electronic health records and data. We may be looking at data sharing agreements, data use agreements, MOUs, business associates agreements. When we're looking at data use agreements, we also have an IT security review to make sure that the data that's leaving IHS's system and going into the other system, university system, maybe a central data repository at maybe NIH or another organization. We look at IT does a security review. We also have our OGC review to look at the legal documents of the data use agreement. And we have a lead statistician review. They have their hands on the actual data. And then we also, again, like I mentioned before, have a privacy officer review from the privacy perspective. We also look at how research activities might affect patient care, staffing, and resources. The primary mission of IHS is to provide healthcare. Research is not the primary mission of IHS, although we do participate and collaborate around research. The priority when we're reviewing research protocols is to make sure that the priority stays on the patient and patient care. When dealing with, let's see here. The main point about these last two slides is just for researchers to reach out to IHS IRB chairs in advance to try to get some guidance and be clear about what all types of agreements and the review process that will be taking place. So this is just some information about the various types of tribal and independent tribal organization IRBs and the research oversight that takes place within tribal communities and within IHS. Some tribes administer their own IRBs, for example, Cherokee Nation, Chickasaw Nation, Navajo Nation. Some tribes rely on tribal colleges or university IRBs. For example, the Lummi Nation works with the Northwest Indian College IRB for review of research that takes place in their community. Some tribes rely on other independent tribal organization IRBs, like the Pueblos in New Mexico work with the Southwest Tribal IRB for review of research in their communities. The California Rural Indian Health Board up in Northern California, Sacramento, reviews research for tribes that are members of the California Rural Indian Health Board. And some tribes who do not have an IRB might have a research review committee, which is not a formal IRB, but it does serve a similar function. And they're the group that would review for that tribal community. Some tribes work with their councils and or their health departments for reviews. There's quite a variety of tribes and how tribes handle review of research. And there's roughly around maybe 50 types of different tribe and independent tribal organizations. And there's probably more now of how research gets reviewed and how the tribes and IHS oversee research in their communities. And this is just a list of some of the tribal IRBs and independent tribal organization IRBs. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. And I'm just so excited to be able to share information and again, to be part of this panel. Thank you very much.
Hello, and so welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I come from the land of the Swinomish at the Great Pacific Northwest. I'm residing here today. So happy to be joining you. And today my discussion is going to focus on a curriculum that was developed in collaboration with over 30 other American Indians and Alaska Native people and allies. So this is a basic training curriculum, and I'm just going to highlight some of the content from it. And so the content we're going to talk about today is really kind of understanding the role of IRBs in relation to tribal oversight. We're specifically going to look at the 3 principles of the Belmont report and look at it from an Indigenous perspective, and then identify signs of what it means to have an equitable partnership. We're going to specifically look at the CFRs as they pertain, Ms. Tracy spoke about the individual level, but there's also that community level she referred to. So we're going to look at that as it pertains to individual and group harms, privacy and confidentiality, and then discuss a little bit about confidentiality. So I was funded, or we were funded by the National Institute of Health to design and validate a new training curriculum for the conduct of ethical research with Native American communities. These are over the 30 people that helped develop it. We had 3 panels, a community panel, scientific panel, and a policy panel. It was an iterative process. We started off with the community. When we first started our work, we thought we were going to adapt the commonly known CITI training. Within the first hour of our meeting with the community panel, they said, why are we adapting somebody else's understanding or interpretation of the Code of Federal CFRs? And it was most often right. Community was, right on topic. And so we threw out the city and actually pulled up the CFRs, and we developed the curriculum from that. And then it went through, like I said, it was an iterative process, and we had about 80% of consistent participation through the entire process. So we tested this in a randomized control trial. Half the group was randomized into take the city program, the other half into our ethics. And what we have found was that although that the city training did quite well, those who took our ethics training had actually higher passing knowledge scores, self-efficacy scores, knowledge in reviewing protocol, and applying the CFRs from an Indigenous perspective. And so here are some of the highlights. One of the first things that this panel really wanted to drive home was tribal sovereignty. And the definition of tribal sovereignty is that the tribes have the inherent right to make their own laws, enact regulations, and determine what research can take place on their lands. When you're looking at that and you compare that to the IRB oversight, this is what this slide does. So tribal sovereignty, you can approve and deny requests, decide how research is reviewed or conducted. We've heard this from the other panelists as well. And then require research activity to stop at any given point, review research reports, press releases, publications before they are publicly shared. They have a right to say what content, how that content is shared, especially as it pertains to identifying the tribe, if there's any cultural knowledges or practices, and they have the right to restrict any tribal identifiers in the report. Conversely, if you look at the IRB oversight, and I think Ms. Tracy did a lovely job of saying what the IRB does, they're really looking at how the CFRs are being applied in the research project itself. They have the authority to approve and require modifications to the research activity, but do keep in mind that if an IRB says you can conduct a research and the tribe says no, it's not going to happen. Conversely, if the tribe says, yes, the research is ready to go, we're happy to have it, but the IRB says, no, we've got some concerns about this research and modifications or changes need to be made, then that has to be done as well. When we're looking at this Belmont principles, there's 3 primary principles. This is beneficence, respect, and justice. So from specifically when it pertains to beneficence, in the CFRs, this is to do no harm. But what we heard from the panelists who created our ethics was that it's not enough not to do no harm, but the intent is to actually do good, and to do good with expected results that it will directly benefit Native people. And there has to be established in trust and an equitable partnership. But how do you know whether trust is being developed or has been developed? How do you know the partnership is equitable? How do you know that the letter of support that you have received is from the appropriate from the appropriate leaders? Well, in this slide, we can see some of the indications of a good partnership. What was the tribal approval process? You know, as Ms. Tracy just stated, there are different protocols for different tribes and even for the different types of study. A review process for a student's qualitative study might look very, very different from a review process of a randomized clinical trial where you're attempting to change behavior. And then also look at the length of the relationship. Did somebody just come into a community and there's like 6 months and they, hey, I have a great idea? Or was it very well thought out? And I think Dr. Elliott spoke to this fact. It takes years to develop these relationships and have the conversation in developing the protocol and developing the research project where all voices are involved and heard. What's the formal documentation? Is there a tribal resolution, an MOU, an MOA? What does that paperwork look like? And do keep in mind, because of the diversity across tribal nations, it's not going to be the same for every group. And then the other thing you can think about is, are there multiple letters of support? Is the research coming in for an IRB review and there's one letter from a department manager? Or do you see those letters from multiple leaders across the tribe? And then also the distributions of funds. Are the funds sitting all in the academic partners' hands, or is it there's a distribution and paying for the cost of doing the research, such as staffing, rent for the facility, other types of costs are being covered with those research dollars. The next concept is justice. So there's two, we look at justice from two perspectives. There's procedural justice, but the procedures are fair and non-exploitive, but there's also distributive justice. Those who experience the risk should also experience the benefit. So under the principle of justice, as research dollars themselves, where they flow to, and researchers are obligated to conduct research with American Indians and Alaska Native communities, but that research must be conducted in a way that the tribes want, as research is being conducted on their lands. The next concept is respect for persons, and mostly we think about this as the consent form. Now, do keep in mind it's a consent process and not just the documentation of consent. So just like when you're consenting an individual into a research project, you would talk to them about the research, you would explain to them the risk and the benefits, you would talk to them about their commitment to their involvement with the time, anything else, and you also give them the space to make the decision. And so too, should this be with communities. In this slide here, we present two different informed consent processes. And if you look, there's on the individual side, we have recruitment. This is normally what you think of when you recruit an individual. There, you get the flyers, you post those, then there's a pre-screening to see if they're eligible, and then there's the documentation of consent, and then the participants get involved in the study, which time they can withdraw. Actually, you can withdraw from a study at any point in this process. Well, so too can a community. Community starts with recruitment. When you go to a community or you're working with a community and you're telling them about the research, they could be very excited in the beginning, and then halfway through the project, they can decide to withdraw. But there is a recruitment for community. There's that protocol development that we all refer to, defining the participants, what methods are going to be used, what kind of culture and language is going to be involved in the process, and then documenting consent. This can be seen as in tribal approval, resolutions, and data sharing agreements. And then the participation, the community participation level is looking at the receipt of funding, provision of resources, And then there's also that broad consent. Where does that research go from there? If there's additional approval processes that will have to be considered. Another concept is looking at individual autonomy versus tribal authority. So research activities that take place on tribal land need tribal approval. Research that takes place with Native Americans off tribal lands does not require tribal approval. However, if you're collecting tribal identifiers, then any use of those tribal identifiers must have tribal approval. And then if you're conducting research not on tribal lands, then individual rights take precedence when research is off tribal lands. So next concept is benefits. Usually we look at benefits from an individual perspective or a research perspective. In this next few slides, we're going to step back a moment and look at benefits from a community level. So there's 6 kind of categories. We group this into relational knowledge, treatment, materials, and training opportunities and empowerment. So at the community level, we have relational ties, which is when an academic and tribal community develop a relationship. What are the benefits for the tribe? What is the benefits for the community that they can obtain? And this is where the researcher can help with the tribe gain data from their particular community to help them develop their own, or to use that data for them to develop their own policies and to develop future grants and bring in extra funding for them to improve and enhance their programs. We also have the knowledge, where the community gains additional knowledge about their strengths and vulnerabilities. And then treatment opportunities. Instead of asking the community to take an evidence-based intervention that they can just take and grab off the shelf, that was often developed in other communities, other cultures, from other worldviews, they have the opportunity to create something specifically for their communities based on their values and their culture. Access to the manuals, so again, they'll have the manual developed specifically for themselves, and there's other resources through grant funding so they can train their staff and grow their infrastructure. And then training opportunities, often with research dollars, you get people coming in and personally training your staff at no expense to the community. And then empowerment, as the communities develop their own materials and their own research infrastructure and apply for their own funding dollars. That gives them the empowerment to continue to build those research dollars and experience. The next slide speaks to assessing risk. So in this one, we want to think about is that the risks that are familiar to the reviewers are often viewed as low risk, or even when they may be far riskier than unfamiliar risk. And also there may be risk you don't even perceive. And this is even true from a researcher that is coming from the community. If you're working with if you're a young person, are you really familiar or have knowledge of what risk an elder person may think of? So what the curriculum also stresses is how to reduce those risks. And one of the best ways to reduce that is having the community review of all the protocol. Community is helping to design the protocol, the community is reviewing that protocol, and the other considerations to take and the other topics to take into consideration is, again, what Ms. Elliott spoke about was the words use and their connotations in the materials and the consent form, the reading levels, even where the research itself is being conducted. There was a story of a researcher was wanting to develop an elder center, invited elders in, to the building for which the proposed research was going to take place, asked the elders multiple questions about their experiences. And this was resulted in the elders being very upset. And come to find out, the building that the researcher was inviting the elders into was an old boarding school where a lot of atrocities and horrors had taken place. And if the researcher would have had review of community, would have had community involvement, they would have known to reconsider where the research would be taking place. Another topic is one between privacy. So privacy is about the individual. So this is about privacy versus public behavior. We would see if ours are written, it says public behavior is not considered research with human subjects. However, what one group may think is private or maybe public may actually be private. So considering, especially in Indian country, a lot of ceremony takes place in public settings. So really thinking twice, it's not up to a researcher to walk and observe that, take that information or take that data without tribal approval. The next concept is between anonymity and confidentiality. So both of these are about the data. And often when we think about an anonymous data, it's when there is no link from a person or a community. And then with confidentiality, it's when there's a link connected. Now, it doesn't mean connected to the data. And so that doesn't mean that you do not collect any identifiers. It's really about that link between the two. And so this has to be also considered at the community level. So protecting the identifiers of Native community, such as the name or even the geographical area. There are some communities that are quite small. If I said that I was working with the largest tribe in the state of Washington, you can easily find out who that is. And so you've just identified a tribal community when they may have not wanted to be identified. And then the next concept is really looking at what is considered vulnerable. One of the things that this group really got across is like Native people as a group is not a vulnerable population. It's the situation that makes one vulnerable. And this is really important when you're considering your research protocol, because you want to look at the situation and you want to reduce the vulnerability out of that situation. And so our ethics looks at vulnerability from a situational stance. So there's the individual and personal, the relational and the environmental, and then there's subcategories underneath those. So, you think about just recently with COVID and the research that was taking place, sometimes with people literally on their deathbed, and that is a vulnerable situation. So having protocol in place to address that vulnerability and still allow the research to go through because it needed to go through in order to help people. But looking at the situation itself, as opposed to just automatically naming the group. And then finally, there are a couple of tools we wanted to talk about, and you've heard those mentioned throughout this presentation, and that's the data sharing agreement and the research ethics protocol. These are two templates that we have available at our Indigenous Wellness Research Institution. There's a link down below. With our data sharing agreement, it kind of regulates all facets of the study data. It talks about what data will be collected, how it would be reviewed, and it is actually negotiated between the tribal attorneys and the academic attorneys. And then in it says that the grant the data sharing agreement that the tribe will grant the university a royal-free, non-exclusive right to use the data to publish reports in academic publications. This is important because if you're getting federal funds, the information is often generalizable. They use tax dollars, this information's got to get out, but having those important conversations in the beginning of the recruitment process, when we looked at the chart, is important. Have the conversations in the beginning. I often have conversations in the beginning. When we submit the grant, we have to get the formal letters of support and the resolutions of depending on the research project, but also once funding is received. I often stop and say, okay, it looks like we're going to get funded for this grant. Is this something you still want to do? This is what we said we were going to want to do. This is where we're at. Is this still where we're going? And keep in mind, during in that consent process, at any point in time, they could also withdraw their permissions. And then the ethic and research and ethical protocols. This actually just goes in a lot more details and a good conversation to start, a good process to help have those hard conversations with your communities. And then with that, our ethics curriculum is available for free. There's the link for that. And then the toolkit, there's a full complete toolkit with PowerPoint presentations, tests, etc. That is actually under a license. You'll have to obtain a license from UW to distribute that, but information pertaining to that is, the link is there. And they'll also be available through OHRP. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pearson, and thank you all for this wonderful, wonderful discussion. So I know we only have half an hour. I have so many questions written down, and I wish we had more time, but I think I will start with a few of them to get your thoughts on. So all of you mentioned kind of finding common ground, finding the champion, establishing relationships, but these take time. And the traditional grant framework doesn't allow for that much time. How do you balance that? Trying to establish those relationships as a new researcher, if you haven't worked with the community before, how do you identify the champion? How do you establish the relationship and yet try to get your project done in a timely manner? Yes, Dr. Pearson.
I was somewhat fortunate in that I worked with the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, and the community partners would often come to the Institute and say, well, we're interested in an academic researcher. And so at that point, the director was Karina Walters, and she went to the community member came in, and Karina was basically saying, here, you can have that one, which was me. And then I just started going out to the community. It was actually part of my job is going out, hanging, talking to people, attending events, being there, listening to what their concerns are. There was a monthly coalition and just sat at the table and had a conversation and heard. And that took about a year. And then through our institute, there was actually funding just enough to pay for gas and maybe bring some food into the community and to have those conversations. But it really is a commitment of who you are as a researcher, who you are as a person, and what you want to work forward. And then there's also smaller type grants, 20, 30,000 that you could apply for that helps you build up. But that can't stress enough the importance of really putting the time in, because there's no way you know without putting that time in.
Yes, Dr. Manson.
I think there's some very strategic and tactical approaches that one can adopt. First off, if we're talking about early stage investigators, I think Dr. Pearson's point about doing your homework in terms of reaching out to already established investigative teams at various settings, whether it be at universities or healthcare corporations, et cetera, and inquiring about lessons to be learned and soliciting from those individuals guidance about how to approach these matters. The second is doing your homework by linking up with major health advocacy organizations, whether it be the National Indian Health Board, National Congress of American Indians, or the National Council of Urban Indian Health, to understand what their constituents and stakeholders' highest priorities are. Because one of the things that was discussed across all 4 presentations today is the need to discover the mutuality of interests, align your interests with those of your prospective key stakeholders and partners, and they then begin that process. There's a lot to be learned even before you begin, quote unquote, hanging out. And then as Dr. Pearson and I think Dr. Elliott noted as well, it's finding those champions, and we have them, whether they be in the university or they be in the organizations or in those communities. You can learn about them by reaching out to these kinds of key organizations. The last thing is don't be afraid to talk to the program officers at the various institutions sponsoring or that you would like to have sponsored your research. People don't realize, for example, at NIH, there's much more latitude these days than there was 15 years ago to build in strategic planning for implementation into your research that will allow you to actually go out in a systematic way and begin to build these bridges. Also, too, that will allow you, if you're subsequently awarded that grant, to actually compensate the local community research review boards and IRBs for that work. So all of these are lessons to be learned by reaching out and talking to other colleagues in the field who've walked this path already.
Yes, Dr. Elliott.
Agree completely with the other things that were mentioned. The only thing I think I would add is there's sometimes so much pressure to get funding, to be able to support research, that sometimes we get driven by the RFAs or the funding announcements and then want to come up with an idea. And what we found the absolute best way that this works in, again, getting to that true impact, is by having the conversations and finding those really good ideas before the funding. If you have the idea, good ideas will find their funding avenue. It's really hard, especially if you're a new investigator. After you put in a few years, you can have a little bit more latitude on this, but it's still super hard if you're going into a new relationship with someone and you haven't asked, here, can I have a letter of support for this real quick? And you just have to trust that we'll figure out the right project to come together. That's a lot more difficult space to start a relationship than if you just went and said, hey, tell me about your institution. I've got expertise in this area, and I'd like to learn what you're seeing, what's keeping you up at night, where are the problems you're having. And even just having had one of those conversations before going, okay, this RFA came, it reminded me of what you said here. When we submitted for CIRCA, the Collaborative Research Center for American Indian Health, that grant got written in about 6-7 weeks, incredibly complex. But all the conversations that led to it had already happened, where tribes had said, hey, we need help with this infrastructure piece or this infrastructure piece. And we were able to go, remember those conversations? We think we might have something that we could pull it together and see if we can get this to work. And so, again, I think, Dr. Pearson said, go out, have the conversations, meet with people. And again, if you're going out to learn, to listen, that work time and that time spent really will never be wasted.
Thank you. So just following up on that, all of you have had several years of experience working with communities. So what have you changed now than when you first started working? What are you doing something different than you first did when you started working? And anybody can go first.
Well, that was 45 years ago for me, so it's hard to remember. I don't think there's anything different. I think there's been a gradual accumulation of lessons learned and building from each. I've learned nothing ventured, nothing gained. Swallow the anxiety that you may experience in reaching out to new, novel settings and communities, having sought out those champions. as Dr. Elliott just said, listen quietly and learn from their example about how to engage your prospective partners. Do not fear failing forward in an authentic fashion. Not everything succeeds, but be positioned to take away the lessons from failing and do a critical analysis of why that failure may have happened. My experience is that we Native people, all things considered, are extremely indulgent and forgiving. It amazes me how indulgent and forgiving we are when people are respectful and recognize the importance of the perspectives and the knowledge that we hold. So, you know, but do it deliberately, thoughtfully, and respectfully.
Go ahead, Dr. Pearson.
I agree. I think it's just the building over time and more the lessons learned. And I still continue to spend the time every month, you know, going out in the communities and the importance in listening. And I do agree with Dr. Manson. Be humble, and it's okay when you get your hand slapped. It's good that you do, because then you learn and they're committed and there's that support for you to learn. And I think that's when you know you have really developed an equitable partnership. When your partner can communicate and you both can communicate in a way where you can say what's good and what's not, and where you failed and where you need to learn, and that's growth. And that's a good thing.
Yes, Rachel.
I agree with both Dr. Manson and Dr. Pearson. I think for me personally, when I was 25 years ago, when I first started working with communities, I think the biggest thing that I had to change was to build that patience, just being patient, again, of course, with the humility and respect. But for me, I think that was probably the most challenging thing, was to build that patience and learn how to settle down and go with the flow, you know, and not be afraid to reach out and have, like you said, Dr. Pearson, those conversations with the community, and then just sit there and be part of the community. Go to their activities, hang out, you know, just and sometimes you don't have to go, and you don't have to go with your agenda. Just go and be part of the community, I think, is one of the best ways to learn from that community. But for me, it definitely was building the patience.
Go ahead.
Oh, I like that one, Tracy. Isn't that true of so many things? Definitely agree completely on all of those. I think one of the things that that I've learned is, and I still remember kind of some of those moments of learning. Maybe for me, I needed to get a little hit on the head a little bit for some of those moments of learning. But one of them was actually when we were establishing Kirk again, and we wanted it to be so tribally driven. And so we would go in and say, tell us what you want. Tell us where your needs are. And I still remember a council member turning to me and going, you're the experts we're bringing in. You need to tell us what some of the options are, maybe what we don't even know that we don't know. And it was, and that did give an invitation, which is always important. But it also was like, what is my role here as well? And trying to make sure then balancing that between with being overly protective of trying to like feel like you're making decisions because this might be too difficult, to giving full information but in an understandable way. And that's, I think, what I continuously get the complexities associated with how to fully engage in an understanding so that everybody is on the same page, feels like they're part of a big team. And I think that I'm much more deliberate about that than maybe I was at the beginning, where I either tried to be very much I'm here to listen, just listen, but not also understanding what my role was at the table and frankly, why I was there in the first place and being invited to that table. So it's that balancing act that I still learn from every day, but that I still remember that question of going, well, that's why we have you here. I'm like, Yeah. Okay. So let me help present some of the things how I'm seeing the world, and then let's see what you're seeing, and then that's when we all come together. But you do have a voice, and you have expertise that actually tried to be partnered with. That's one of the things they've been looking for, is research expertise or help with infant mortality. Doesn't mean I know the answers for them, but I have a role and a voice at that table too. And so I think that's one of the things I've become a little bit more deliberate about as time has went on.
Thank you. Thank you for being so honest and sharing what's worked and what's not worked for you. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and focus on something that Dr. Pearson, you presented about when research is conducted on tribal lands versus off tribal lands. And this is a concern or a criticism that sometimes you hear, is that investigators may want to avoid the complexity of getting tribal approval by taking their research off tribal lands and working with American Indians off tribal lands. How do you respond to that, or what concerns, if any, do you see with that, or are there any concerns with doing research off tribal lands or using or working with communities, urban communities? Anyone?
Okay, well, I can start.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think we also have to respect individual autonomy as well as tribal authority. So, you know, if you think if you are an American citizen and you go to France and you're living there and there is research being conducted that's going to benefit you and you want to participate in that research, they're not going to go ask the United States, right? So and even within the United States, if there's, and I would actually seriously look at the type of research that's being done. You can't identify the tribe. So if you're American Indian, Alaska Native, or if there's a research project and they're collecting tribal identity and they're using that tribal identity in their reports, then you have to get tribal approval, because that's the tribal identity. It's like exposing or using their personal identifiers without informing them. And so if you're just looking at people who happen to be American Indian, Alaska Native race, and you're not doing tribal identities, then that's fine. And it could be really problematic. It's problematic when you're looking at the type of study, especially if it's gene type study, that can be identifiable of tribes, and you have to look at those data. So I think you just have to step back. You have to look at the data. You also have to respect individual authority, autonomy, and tribal authority, and really look at balancing. And then that's where you bring in community. You bring in your IRBs. In urban settings, you talk to urban health boards and urban advocacy groups and get them involved in the study.
Yes, Dr. Manson.
Well, in addition to this, for investigators to assume that one has full license to simply conduct their research without local review and input is foolish, scientifically, as well as politically and organizationally. If you look at the urban Indian health organizations, the vast majority of them have research codes. All the way from very elaborate examples, such as the Seattle Indian Health Board and South Central Foundation in Alaska and Seattle, respectively, even on through others in Wichita and in Colorado and Minneapolis. And the codes and the regulatory processes may differ, but they are there. And that's true of many Indian serving organizations off reservation. The second thing is that it's, while I agree with Dr. Pearson's point about the tensions between individuality and collective membership, it ultimately is in service both of one's own efforts as well as the science to have conversations with the home tribal communities that the particular constituents who are likely to participate in your work in an urban area are members of. if only to make sure that that work is ongoing and known, to help better understand some of the rural and urban differences that are at work that may inform the nature of the science that one proposes to undertake. So one can do much more than just simply assume that one has free license to proceed with impunity while working off reservation, and that you're not subject to regulatory processes. So they are there, both formal and informal.
Yes, Rachel.
I really appreciate Dr. Pearson and Dr. Manson's opinions and view on this point. We deal with that from the IHS perspective when we're dealing with urban communities. We often, or at least I do, we get a lot of questions and outreach by researchers who are trying to do research in urban communities with Native Americans, and wondering, of course, which IRB should they go through. Often having not made some of those contacts that Dr. Manson had mentioned with the urban Indian Native, the urban organizations that are within these communities. We always try to point, even though there's not an IRB that would oversee an urban area like Phoenix, right? There's no IRB in Phoenix that oversees the whole urban community with about, 200 different tribes in Arizona, in Phoenix alone. But we will often talk with the researchers to see where the research is happening, how the research is going to be conducted. We do look at it I look at it from sort of that initial review of an IR, like a protocol, to see where are those touch points that they can be getting in touch with in the urban setting. And like he said, just having those conversations with the urban community, giving the opportunity for those or urban organizations to have a voice in the process. And there are times when the urban Indian organization doesn't, may not have either the capacity, the interest, they may say we don't have jurisdiction over this, but I think there are things that researchers can do deliberately to engage with the Native community besides just trying to recruit individuals into studies.
Yes, Dr. Elliott.
This is a good question. This is actually a question we grapple with on a regular basis. So being part of the health system, we also manage the non-oncology clinical trial portfolio for the health system. Let me give an example. So if someone's inpatient and our health system in our hospital in Sioux Falls, non-reservation based in Sioux Falls, is a flagship hospital that brings people from all over the region. Someone with COVID is admitted into that. We had the Regeneron monoclonal antibody studies going. There's follow-up for that has to happen. So if you have someone within the inpatient setting that qualifies for treatment with that, however, all the follow-up studies would happen on tribal lands, for example, how does that work? Because again, these are decisions that have to be made in such a short amount of time, because it's literally the provision of care that's also going on where these things get complex. Where we've landed is have the conversations, ask the questions, reach out, try to be able to, at the end of the day, always do what's in the best interest for the participant while fully making sure everything is transparent as possible. What I also don't want to see happen, though, is that there's lack of access to some of these trials, for example, that are state-of-the-art care in some conditions, that literally American Indians are being excluded simply because of geography of where they live, zip codes as well. And again, individual choices and all those things. How do we make sure we're balancing that? But that's actually one of those conversations that we're having a lot right now internally with partners, all of those sorts of things, because it gets murky and gray and unclear. And the best way we know how to handle it is just have open conversations and be as transparent as possible. But I don't know if I may be asking more of a question than answering. But I just wanted to show that's an area where we continue to ask questions around this, because it's a frequent uh, concern and need that we're seeing. So, oh, Rachel, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
I don't know if I have your answer, but something just came to mind.
Got my note. I'm ready.
For people to keep in mind when working with even urban Indian organizations. Many of our health boards are made up of participants or representative tribes that become members of the health board or an urban Indian organization. And these urban Indian organizations may speak on behalf from an advocacy standpoint, often from that political perspective. And like, just for example, I'll just put something out there like National Indian Health Board. They have how many tribes as members? But at the end of the day, they do have that role as an advocacy group for these member tribes. But at the end of the day, those individual tribes still have their own tribal sovereignty and rights to voice what their opinion is as far as what's going on with their community members, even if their community members are in an urban community. I guess my point is that these tribal organizations, these urban Indian organizations may be made up of member tribes, but they may not, just because that urban Indian organization says, yes, you can conduct this research and we're in support of it, that doesn't necessarily mean that one member tribe is going to agree to that, when it comes to their community and their people. So I think just to the point is just to have the conversation and making sure that sponsors, supporters, researchers are not taking that one voice and running with it, because sometimes we talk with researchers or whoever, and we say, did you consult with, American Indian or whoever? And they say yes. And they could have talked with one person. And then they take that one person's opinion and run with it and say, we consulted with American Indians or Alaska Natives. I don't think I answered your question, Dr. Elliott.
No, it's a good point to always make sure who you're bringing into the conversation and how to have it. I think where the tricky part becomes is, and again, the COVID inpatient studies, I think, were one of the best examples I can think of. Enrollment and the provision of things is happening within the health system, but all the follow-up is in another location, and wanting to be mindful of the right jurisdictions and getting the right approvals and things like that can sometimes start to preclude what's offered to patients, which that worries me. If we don't have some of those systems worked out quite yet. We're getting there. We're having the conversations.
Well said. Yeah, I think, yes, more work needs to be done, especially when you think about the NIH's and call for more inclusion of minorities in clinical trials. I think it makes some of these conversations really important for us to keep working on. So I'm afraid we're getting close to time, and I'm going to hand over the baton now to Yvonne to close out the session.
So I'll take this opportunity to thank everybody, all our invited guests on this workshop, and of course, everyone in the audience. And last but not least, actually, the cyber god. I think that we've had a really smooth running event, which is amazing, because I'm not an IT person and I often, cannot sleep because of, what might happen. So I think we've had a really, really good conference. And I think one thing that I have to say is that, you listen and you just, if you pay attention and you listen, you really learn things. And I think what we have heard today, not apply only in the realm of doing research with the American Indian and Alaska Native populations. But in fact, in this day and age, when we are so concerned with justice and equitability, I think that a lot of the work that has been done by all of you actually can be applied and expanded into other areas. And in a way, it's interesting because as you were talking, I was just wondering that in fact, research in going forward now with more general, more usual communities, if you like, we almost have to pick up on that model that you guys are so familiar with, right? So I think this conversation has been wonderful, and I just want to thank everybody for their participation. Last but not least, I also want to say that the archived video, and there will be a summary report as well, will be available soon on the same website that you access this workshop. So with that, I want to just thank you everybody for their participation. And speakers, invited guests, I will be in touch. Thank you. Um, so if there are any questions from the audience and that you feel that they have not been addressed, do feel free to send your questions to ohrp@hhs.gov. That is the standard OHRP mailbox. You can indicate in the subject field that these are questions specifically regarding the AIAN workshop, and we'll try our best to organize and send these questions to the respective invited guests so that they could maybe help with responding to them. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.